Disclaimer: it's inspired by reality, shaped by imagination.
It was supposed to be a lighthearted night on Jimmy Kimmel Live, jokes, stories, and that usual late-night charm. But when Mark Wahlberg walked on stage, the tone shifted fast. The topic, should children's screen time be limited by law? What started as a friendly chat turned into one of the most heated and uncomfortable live moments in recent TV memory. Jimmy Kimmel, ever the comedian, teased the idea that parents shouldn't need the government to raise their kids. "We can't legislate bedtime, Mark," he joked. But Mark didn't laugh. He leaned forward, eyes locked on Jimmy, and said, "It's not bedtime I'm worried about. It's who's raising our kids while we're busy scrolling." The studio audience, usually ready to laugh at anything, fell silent. You could almost feel the tension crackling through the room. As the debate went on, Mark's calm, faith-driven sincerity collided with Jimmy's trademark sarcasm. What followed wasn't just an argument, it was a cultural clash over parenting, personal responsibility, and the cost of letting screens raise a generation. By the end of the night, Mark Wahlberg would walk off the stage, leaving Jimmy visibly shaken, and the internet completely divided. The night started like any other late show. Bright lights, a buzzing audience, and Jimmy Kimmel's signature smirk as he welcomed one of Hollywood's most recognizable faces. "Ladies and gentlemen, Mark Wahlberg!" The crowd erupted, clapping and cheering as Mark walked out in his usual understated style. Black jacket, jeans, and that steady, grounded walk that said he wasn't there to perform, he was there to talk. Jimmy leaned forward with that familiar grin. "Mark Wahlberg, ladies and gentlemen, actor, producer, father of four," he paused with a teasing look, "and apparently part-time parenting expert now." The audience chuckled. Mark smiled politely, but his eyes didn't share the humor. "Nah, just a full-time dad trying to raise kids in a world that's kind of lost its mind." He laughed, leaning back in his chair. "Well, tonight we're diving into a fun little topic. Should the government actually limit how much screen time kids get? I mean, what's next? A bedtime bill?" The audience laughed again, but Mark stayed still, his expression firm. "You joke about it, but it's not funny when you see what's happening to families. Kids spend 7, 8 hours a day staring at screens. They don't talk to their parents. They don't play outside. It's not childhood anymore. It's conditioning." He raised an eyebrow. "Conditioning? Or just devolution? I mean, screens are part of life now, Mark. My son knows how to use an iPad better than I do. That's not the end of the world. It's progress." "Progress isn't always a good thing, Jimmy. Just because we can do something doesn't mean we should. Look, I grew up with nothing. My mom didn't need an app to tell me to go outside. She told me, go find something real to do, and I did." A murmur rippled through the audience, some clapping, others nodding. Jimmy, sensing the tension building, tried to lighten it. "So you're saying the government should step in and tell parents how to raise their kids?" He shook his head. "I'm saying parents aren't doing it. If the government can ban cigarettes from playgrounds, why can't we talk about protecting kids from digital addiction? We've got laws for everything else." That word addiction hung heavy in the air. Jimmy's tone shifted, a bit sharper now. "Addiction's a strong word. Come on, you really think letting your kid play video games or watch TikTok is the same as giving them a pack of cigarettes?" Mark didn't flinch. "Not the same, but it's close. You're still numbing them. You're still letting something else control their minds. The problem is, we don't call it what it is because we're addicted too." The crowd went quiet again. It wasn't a typical Kimmel laugh-a-minute moment. It was something more real, more uncomfortable. Jimmy shifted in his seat, sensing the weight of what Mark said, but unwilling to let go of the bit. "So you want President Biden to issue a no TikTok after 8 p.m. order?" Mark smiled slightly, but his voice stayed serious. "If that's what it takes to get families talking again, maybe. But it's not about the government. It's about parents stepping up. I just don't see it happening unless somebody shakes things up." Jimmy tried again to steer the conversation back into humor, but Mark wasn't playing along. Every joke fell flat against Mark's steady tone. He wasn't angry, just deeply, visibly disappointed with where society had gone. He leaned forward. "You know, when I go to dinner with my family, I make everyone put their phones in a basket. No exceptions. We talk, we laugh. My kids hate it at first, but by the end of the night, they're smiling. Because connection, real connection, feels better than any screen." The crowd applauded softly this time, not the raucous clapping of entertainment, but the kind that comes from agreement. Jimmy looked around, then back at Mark. "That's sweet, Mark, really. But not everyone's got the luxury of family dinners and baskets for phones. People work. Life's busy. Screens are how we stay connected now." Mark's expression darkened. "No, screens are how we pretend to stay connected. You're telling me scrolling through fake pictures and filtered lives is connection? You're smarter than that, Jimmy." The air thickened. Even the camera operators hesitated before zooming in, as if unsure whether to capture this raw energy or let it breathe. Jimmy smirked, trying to recover. "I just think people should be able to decide for themselves. That's freedom, right?" Mark nodded. "Freedom means responsibility, too. If you don't guide your kids, somebody else will. And I promise you, Silicon Valley's happy to take that job." It was the kind of line that drew a few gasps. Someone in the audience whispered, "He's right," just loud enough for a mic to pick up faintly. Jimmy exhaled, clearly uncomfortable now. "So what, you'd support a law? Really? That sounds like the kind of thing conservatives used to complain about." Mark shrugged. "Maybe I'm old-fashioned, but if something's poisoning families, I don't care what side of politics it's on. It needs to stop." There was a pause, a real heavy silence. Mark sat back, calm but unwavering, while Jimmy shuffled his cards, his usual confidence cracking. The band wasn't playing, the laughter sign hadn't lit up, no one seemed to know how to move on. Finally, Jimmy cleared his throat and said, "Well, I didn't think this conversation would get so serious." Mark smiled faintly. "Maybe it's about time it did." The audience applauded again, louder this time, but not for Jimmy. The segment was far from over, but everyone in the room could feel it. The sparks had turned into fire, and it wasn't cooling down anytime soon.
When they returned from the commercial break, you could almost feel the tension still humming beneath the laughter track. Jimmy Kimmel leaned forward, pretending to shake off the awkward silence that had ended the last segment. All right, he said with his trademark grin. "We're back with Mark Wahlberg, who apparently wants to ban fun and Wi-Fi." The crowd laughed, relieved to break the tension, but Mark didn't even crack a smile. He leaned in toward Jimmy, resting his elbows on his knees. "You can joke all you want, man, but you know I'm right about what's happening to kids today." Jimmy raised an eyebrow. Right or just nostalgic? Every generation thinks the next one's falling apart. My dad said TV would rot my brain. Turns out I made a career from it. "Yeah," Mark shot back, "and now you're helping it right everyone else's." The room went still again, half the crowd gasping, the other half breaking into uneasy laughter. Jimmy blinked, caught off guard. "Wow, okay, that's a little harsh, don't you think?" Mark shook his head. "Not at all. I'm not saying it to be mean, but let's be real. These talk shows, the late-night stuff, the endless streaming, it's all distraction. You can't tell me any of this makes people better." Jimmy crossed his arms and leaned back in his chair. "So what, you're saying entertainment's the problem now? Come on, Mark, you are entertainment. You've been in, 30 action movies?" Mark didn't miss a beat. "Yeah, but I make movies, not mind traps. People watch a movie for 2 hours, they leave, they live their lives. But this constant scrolling, this constant noise, it's never off. That's the difference." The crowd was dead quiet again. Jimmy tried to laugh it off, but even he could tell this wasn't going the way he'd planned. "Okay, so now the guy who shot Shooter wants to teach America about mindfulness," he teased, forcing a chuckle. Mark gave him a look that could cut through glass. "You know what, Jimmy? I'd rather talk about God and family than TikTok trends. You can keep your jokes, but you can't laugh off what's happening out there." It wasn't the line of the night, it was the moment of the night. A ripple of applause spread through the audience. Some clapped quietly, others more boldly. Jimmy's jaw tightened just slightly as he glanced at the producers off camera, probably wondering if they should cut to break early. But Mark wasn't done. Kids today are anxious, depressed, lonely. They don't even know why. They think it's them, but it's not. It's this environment we've built. It's phones, it's content, it's noise, and we're pretending it's fine because it makes money. Jimmy tapped his cue cards on the desk, a nervous tic he couldn't hide. I think you're overstating it a bit. Technology also brings people together. Look at long-distance families, global friendships, charities, learning. There's a lot of good out there, too. Mark nodded. Sure, if you use it right, but that's like saying whiskey's fine if you drink 1 glass a year. Nobody does that. They binge, and that's what's happening with screens. You think an 8-year-old knows when to stop scrolling? The crowd clapped again. A few people even shouted, "Exactly!" Jimmy tried to laugh it off, but his patience was thinning. You sound like you want us to go back to 1950. No TV, no phones, just candlelight and bedtime prayers. Mark leaned forward, his voice steady but firm. No, I want balance and discipline. You think the world's better when a dad can't get his son to look up from his screen long enough to say grace? You think that's progress? For a moment, Jimmy looked like he wanted to say something, but the audience reaction threw him off. They weren't laughing anymore. They were listening to Mark. Mark kept going, his voice taking on a kind of quiet intensity. You know what's crazy? Parents complain about kids being addicted to screens while they're sitting there doing the same thing. Whole families in one room, nobody talking. Everyone in their own bubble. That's not living, man. That's surviving on fumes. Jimmy looked to the camera, half grinning, half grimacing. Oh, that's a cheerful picture. Mark Wahlberg, everyone. He'll be starting his Amish reboot next spring. The audience laughed, but it felt hollow. Mark didn't react. He just smiled slightly. You can make jokes, Jimmy, but that's what you do. You joke about serious things until nobody feels them anymore. The crowd let out an audible oof. Jimmy's smile faltered for the first time. He set his cards down, no longer pretending. I don't come on your movie sets and tell you how to act. Maybe don't come on my show and tell me how to raise my kids. Mark's tone softened a little, but his eyes stayed locked at him. Fair. But I'm not talking about just your kids. I'm talking about all of ours. He looked out at the audience, his voice carrying a steady calm that contrasted the tension on set. We're supposed to be guiding the next generation, not distracting them to death. If that's controversial, then maybe we've lost the plot. The audience clapped again, louder this time. Some even stood. The camera crew didn't know whether to cut or let it roll. Jimmy straightened his tie, trying to reclaim his rhythm. You've got a real gift for guilt-tripping people, Mark. Maybe that's why you're such a great actor. Mark smiled faintly, shaking his head. I'm not guilt-tripping anyone. I'm just telling the truth. And the truth doesn't always make people comfortable. For a few seconds, they just stared at each other, two men from completely different worlds, locked in a standoff under studio lights. Jimmy with his sarcasm, Mark with his conviction. The energy was electric, unpredictable. Jimmy finally exhaled and tried to break the silence. All right, I think we're going to need a stronger drink after this. Mark chuckled, but only slightly. Or maybe just less screen time. The audience roared, half with laughter, half with applause. But even then, there was a sense that this wasn't over. The conversation had crossed the line from entertainment to something deeply personal. And as the camera zoomed in on the two men, it was clear the clash wasn't cooling down anytime soon.
When the cameras came back from the next break, the air in the studio felt thick. Jimmy Kimmel tried to lighten things up, flashing his practiced grin at the audience. So before Mark Wahlberg completely bans iPads and fun, let's talk about how we actually parent in 2025. The crowd laughed, but Mark didn't. He sat back in his chair, one hand on his knee, staring straight at Jimmy. You think this is funny? Because you don't see it yet. You don't see what it's doing to families. You don't see it because it's slow, like a leak in a boat. But one day you wake up and you realize you're sinking. Jimmy tilted his head, smirking. You really think it's that dramatic? Mark nodded. Yeah, I've seen it. I live it. My kids have every opportunity in the world, and still, they struggle to be present, to talk, to listen. They're constantly stimulated, but rarely connected. And I know a lot of parents watching right now feel the same. The crowd grew quiet. There was something raw in Mark's tone that wasn't there earlier. Jimmy leaned forward. Okay, but Mark, you can't just legislate that. You can't make laws about screen time. That's not freedom, that's overreach. Mark looked at him sharply. Freedom doesn't mean chaos, Jimmy. Freedom without boundaries destroys people, especially kids. The crowd murmured in agreement. A few even clapped. Jimmy's smile faded a bit. But who decides those boundaries? You? The government? Hollywood? Mark chuckled under his breath. You think Hollywood's setting good examples? You think this town, this industry, cares about what's healthy for families? There it was. The room shifted. Jimmy looked slightly thrown off, but refused to back down. You're part of that industry too, Mark. Don't pretend you're some outsider preaching purity. Mark's eyes darkened. I know, I've made my mistakes, but at least I'm trying to own them now. He paused, his voice dropping a little. You know, I used to believe success could fix everything. The fame, the money, the roles, all that. But none of that means anything when your kids don't talk to you, when they're in the same room but somewhere else, mentally, emotionally. You could hear a pin drop. The audience stopped clapping, stopped whispering. Jimmy, sensing the change, lowered his tone. That sounds personal. Are you talking about your own family? Mark hesitated for a moment, then nodded. Yeah, my son went through a really rough patch a few years ago. Couldn't focus, couldn't sleep, always on his phone. I thought he was just being a teenager, but he was drowning. He didn't even realize it, and neither did I. The crowd went completely silent. Mark continued, his voice trembling slightly but steadying as he went on. We had a real talk one night, first one in months. He told me he didn't feel good enough, that he compared himself to everyone online. Said he hated how fake everything looked, but couldn't stop looking. I felt like I'd failed as a dad, because I'd let that world raise him while I was too busy working. Jimmy leaned back, his expression softening. That's heavy, man. Mark nodded. It was, and it changed everything for me. I started seeing this whole digital thing for what it really is, an addiction. We protect kids from cigarettes, from alcohol, from gambling, but we hand them devices that hijack their brains and call it normal. The audience started clapping, slowly at first, then louder. Jimmy raised his hands to calm the crowd. I don't disagree that it's a problem, but banning things doesn't fix people. Education does. Parents have to take responsibility too. Mark met his gaze. You're right, but most parents are overwhelmed. They're fighting battles they never trained for. You've got single moms trying to work 2 jobs and still be full-time tech monitors. It's not about banning. It's about balance and awareness. And if laws help with that, I don't see the harm. Jimmy exhaled sharply, clearly frustrated. But laws don't teach balance. They just punish people for being human. You can't regulate attention spans, Mark. That got a laugh from part of the audience, but others weren't amused. Mark waited, then said quietly, You can, if what's stealing them is engineered to be addictive. That line landed like a hammer. Even Jimmy didn't have a comeback right away. Anna Navarro, sitting at the panel, finally spoke up. You know, Mark has a point. I have nieces and nephews who can't eat dinner without a tablet in front of them. It's sad. Jimmy looked at her. So what, Anna? You want the government telling you when your niece can use an iPad? Anna shrugged. No, but I'd like parents to get real about what's happening. You can't act like it's harmless when it's not. Joy Bayard jumped in, ever the provocateur. I think we're romanticizing the past. Kids were sneaking out, drinking, getting into trouble long before phones existed. Maybe the real issue isn't the screens, it's parenting. Mark turned to her, calm but firm. You're not wrong, Joy. But back then, at least kids felt their mistakes. They had to face people. Now they just disappear into digital noise. There's no accountability, no emotion, just distraction. Joy shrugged. Or maybe they're just finding their way in a new world. Every generation thinks the next one's doomed. Mark gave her a small, sad smile. Maybe, but I'd rather be wrong while trying to protect them than right after losing them. The crowd erupted in applause, this time long and sustained. Even Jimmy didn't try to interrupt. Jimmy shifted in his chair, rubbing the back of his neck.
You know, you really believe it's that dire, who? Mark nodded slowly. I think if we don't change, we're going to raise a generation that knows everything about the world but nothing about themselves. It wasn't shouted, it wasn't dramatic, but it hit everyone in the room. The camera cut briefly to audience faces, some nodding, some teary-eyed, some just thinking. For a moment, Jimmy didn't know what to say. He glanced at the teleprompter, then back at Mark. You know, I started this show thinking you were being extreme, but I can't argue with that last part. Mark smiled faintly. That's because it's not about politics or control. It's about love. Love for family, for kids, for the world we're leaving behind. The audience applauded again, standing this time. It was rare, very rare, for Jimmy Kimmel Live to turn into something more than comedy. But this moment had crossed that line. The laughter had faded, the masks had slipped, and somewhere between disagreement and understanding, emotion took center stage. But little did anyone know, the night wasn't over, and the real explosion was still coming.
The tension had reached a level that not even Jimmy's usual smirk could smooth over. The audience could sense it. The air was heavier, the laughter forced, and the applause awkwardly scattered. Mark Wahlberg leaned forward, elbows on his knees, voice calm, but eyes sharp. Jimmy, I'm not saying the government should raise kids. I'm saying parents aren't. Someone has to step in when screens are raising an entire generation. Jimmy chuckled, but it didn't sound playful anymore. So what, Uncle Sam's gonna come in and tell me how long my kids can play Mario Kart? That's not freedom, Mark. That's control. Mark shot back quickly. It's not control if it's protection. We already have age limits for alcohol, driving, and movies. Why not screens? We act like digital addiction doesn't exist. It's wrecking attention spans, empathy, everything that makes us human. The crowd murmured in agreement, a few clapping. Jimmy noticed. His expression tightened. He didn't like losing the room. Okay, so you want to ban kids from TikTok and Fortnite. Great idea. Let's see how that works when parents are both working 2 jobs just to survive. You can't legislate good parenting, Mark, Jimmy said, pacing his words for applause. Mark didn't flinch. You're right, you can't, but you can make it harder for corporations to exploit kids for profit. You're a dad, Jimmy. You know how manipulative these platforms are. Jimmy nodded, but his tone turned biting. Sure, but I also don't think we need Hollywood tough guys deciding what's best for our kids. Stick to movies, man. The audience gasped. A low, collective ooh rippled through the studio. Mark's jaw tightened, but he didn't react immediately. He looked at Jimmy, then at the camera. I'm not a tough guy, Jimmy. I'm a father. And maybe that's something you've forgotten how to be when every issue turns into a punchline for you. The air froze. Jimmy blinked, stunned. Even the camera operators hesitated. The audience shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Hey man, that's not fair, Jimmy said, his voice quieter now. I joke because it's what I do, but don't question whether I care about my kids. Mark didn't back down. Then stop laughing off the real stuff, because while you're cracking jokes, there are kids out there losing themselves behind screens while their parents think it's normal. The silence was deafening. Then a few people started clapping, slowly, then louder. Jimmy's face turned from surprise to irritation. Oh, great, now you're the moral compass of America, he said with a forced grin. You know, for someone who made a living blowing things up on screen, you sure sound like you hate entertainment. Mark leaned in. There's a difference between entertainment and exploitation. You know that, but you've got sponsors to please, right? That last line landed like a slap. The audience gasped again. Jimmy's producer, visible off-camera, gave the wrap-it-up signal, but Jimmy ignored it. Say what you want, Mark, but this is my show. Don't walk in here and act like you're saving the world. Mark straightened up, his voice calm again. I didn't come to save the world. I came to say we can do better for our kids, for our future. And if that bothers you, maybe it's because it hits too close to home. Jimmy opened his mouth to reply, but Mark stood up. The move was so sudden that the camera crew didn't know whether to follow him or stay fixed on Jimmy. Where you going? Jimmy asked, half laughing, half nervous. Mark paused, looked out at the audience, then back at Jimmy.
Sometimes the truth doesn't fit inside a punchline. Thanks for the chat." He walked off stage. No dramatic storming, no yelling, just a quiet, firm exit that made it even more powerful. The audience erupted, not sure whether to cheer or stay silent, but most ended up applauding. Jimmy sat there, caught between frustration and disbelief. He tried to smooth it over with a joke, but his words stumbled. "Well, I guess that's one way to end an interview," he said, forcing a smile. "Stick around, folks. After the break, we've got puppies." The crowd laughed awkwardly, still buzzing from what they'd just witnessed. Cameras cut to commercial, but Jimmy stayed seated, rubbing his temples. Behind the scenes, producers were whispering, assistants were panicking, and the internet was already lighting up. Clips were being uploaded within seconds. Mark Wahlberg walking out on Jimmy Kimmel Live. Some were calling it heroic. Others said it was staged. But one thing was clear. No one was talking about puppies. And as the studio lights dimmed, Jimmy knew he'd just lost control of the narrative to a man who refused to play for laughs.
The studio lights had barely cooled before the fallout began. Within an hour, #MarkWahlbergWalksOut was trending across every platform. Clips of the moment, his calm exit, Jimmy's stunned silence, were everywhere. The internet, as usual, was split in half. One side called Mark a hero. Finally, one tweet read, "Someone calls out how we joke about everything serious." Another said, "He didn't walk out in anger, he walked out in peace, and that's what hit hardest." The other half mocked him. "Oh, please, Mark Wahlberg lecturing on morality. Give me a break." Some even accused him of staging it for attention. But those who watched the full segment knew better. They saw the shift, the way his tone changed, the stillness in his voice, the weight behind his words. Backstage, Mark sat in his dressing room for a long time. He didn't speak. His publicist paced nervously, checking her phone every few seconds. "It's everywhere," she said finally. "People are reacting. Some think you overstepped. Some think you nailed it." Mark just nodded. "Good," he said softly. "At least they're thinking." Meanwhile, in the studio, Jimmy Kimmel sat at his desk long after the camera stopped rolling. He stared at the empty guest chair, still processing how quickly the tone had shifted. The jokes that had only saved him suddenly felt empty. His producer approached carefully. "You want to address it tomorrow?" He hesitated. "I don't know, maybe I owe him a call." That night, both men sat in separate corners of Los Angeles, scrolling through the digital storm they'd created, one feeling vindicated, other reflective. Mark wasn't angry. If anything, he felt calm. He thought, this was bound to happen. We've stopped listening. We talk, we argue, but no one hears anyone anymore. The irony wasn't lost on him. He just made that exact point on live television about social media and digital noise. But underneath the noise, something real was happening. Teachers shared clips in classrooms. Parents debated in group chats. A few lawmakers even weighed in, saying it raised valid questions about children's mental health and screen time. For once, a celebrity argument wasn't just entertainment. It had sparked a real conversation. The next morning, Jimmy addressed it briefly on his show. The crowd was curious, waiting for him to make a joke. But he didn't. "Last night got a little intense," Jimmy said. "Mark and I disagreed, and it got real. I want to say, I respect the guy. I may not agree with him, but he cares. You could feel that." It wasn't an apology, but it wasn't mockery either. Just honesty. That small moment, Jimmy letting his guard down, didn't trend as much as the walkout, but it mattered. Because it showed that sometimes, even a late-night comedian could step back and reflect. 2 days later, Mark released a short video on his Instagram. He was sitting in his home gym, wearing a hoodie, speaking directly to the camera. "Look, I didn't walk off because I was angry. I walked off because the conversation stopped being a conversation. We're losing that. Real talk, human talk. We live in a world where silence is rare and noise is constant. But silence, sometimes, is where change starts." He paused for a moment, his tone grounded and gentle. "I've made a lot of movies about fighting. But what I've learned is that the hardest battles aren't physical. They're moral. They're about how we raise the next generation. And I just hope we're still paying attention." That clip went viral too, but for different reasons. It wasn't explosive. It wasn't dramatic. It was thoughtful, measured, and human. Even Jimmy liked the post quietly. No comment, just a small gesture, the kind that said, "Yeah, I heard you." Over the next week, the story took on its own life. News outlets replayed it, analysts debated it, and parents across the country started rethinking how their kids spent time online. Some even said they turned off their family's Wi-Fi for a weekend just to see what would happen. Some found it frustrating. Others said it was the best 2 days they'd had in years. And maybe that was the real win. For Mark, it wasn't about being right. It was about waking people up, reminding them that not everything important fits into a soundbite. He didn't care if people called him dramatic. He cared that someone somewhere had dinner with their kid without checking their phone. That was enough. Weeks later, when he was asked about it during a press junket for his new film, Mark smiled slightly. "You know, I didn't plan to walk out," he said. "It just felt like the right thing to do. Sometimes you don't have to shout to make a point. You just have to stand up and walk away." The interviewer nodded. "Would you go back on Jimmy's show?" Mark chuckled. "Maybe someday. We'll talk, off camera this time." The clip ended there, but it carried something rare: humility. Because in an age where every argument turns into content, Mark Wahlberg had done something almost radical. He stopped talking. He left. He let silence do the work. And that silence echoed louder than any punchline. If you like this powerful moment, make sure to subscribe for more celebrity clashes, emotional showdowns, and unforgettable TV moments. Drop a comment below. Do you think Mark was right to walk out, or should he have stayed and finished the debate?